Introduced at round 5 of the 1979 Formula 1 World Championship, the Williams FW07 was the first Williams Formula 1 car to win a Grand Prix, taking victory at the team's home race at Silverstone. The car would go on to win 4 more times in 1979 before going on to be the dominant force in the 1980 championship with the FW07B. Although the FW07B struggled with reliability in the first half of the season, this was gradually ironed out and the car became a regular podium finisher. The FW07B would go on to win 6 times in the 1980 season, with 5 of those victories coming at the hands of eventual world champion Alan Jones. Williams would go on to take both championships that season, their first championships in Formula 1. With 120 points in the Constructors, nearly double that of second-placed Ligier. The FW07B only competed in 1980, but variants of the car continued to compete until it was retired in 1982, taking an additional Constructors' Championship. Competing in the 1988 season, the Williams FW12 was the first naturally aspirated Williams since 1982, after the Works Honda engine deal that the team had collapsed. The FW12 would be powered by a 3.5 litre Judd CV V8 engine, and it was a terrible engine. Although the aerodynamics and chassis of the car were good, the car was woefully slow in a straight line and woefully unreliable, with driver Nigel Mansell only finishing a race twice the entire season. His teammate Riccardo Patrese didn't have as woeful reliability, and he managed to score a bit more frequently as a result, but couldn't outscore Mansell, as Mansell did actually achieve 2 podiums. Mansell would be substituted for 2 races due to illness, and in one of these races was the Italian Grand Prix, where his replacement Jean-Louis Schlesser would go down in infamy for crashing out Ayrton Senna on the final laps, handing victory to Ferrari. Introduced at the first round of the 1991 Formula 1 season, the Williams FW14 would prove to be one of the most technologically advanced Formula 1 cars ever put to track. The car, however, struggled with reliability in the first few races of the season, and although these issues would be gradually ironed out, these issues ultimately prevented Williams from taking championship glory that season, with Nigel Mansell and Williams finishing second fiddle to Ayrton Senna and McLaren. 1992, however, would be Williams' year, and they introduced the updated FW14B as a stopgap to contest the opening few rounds of the season until the revolutionary FW15 was ready. However, the FW14B proved to be so good that the FW15 was not needed, and the 14B contested the entirety of the season. The FW14B would take 6 1-2 victories over the course of the season, including 4 in the first 5 races. This run of 5 straight victories would ultimately come to an end in Monaco when Mansell had a titanic battle with the McLaren of Senna in the closing laps of the race. The other teams would catch up a little bit to the FW14B as the season went on, with McLaren MP4/7 being the primary contender, though there was some minor competition from Benetton. The FW14B also did not have rock-solid reliability, especially towards the end of the season with a run of 3 retirements in 4 races for Mansell. Nevertheless, the FW14B was without a doubt the dominant force of the 1992 season, and Nigel Mansell would take his first and only Formula 1 World Championship with the team. Mansell would take 9 victories that year, with Patrese taking a single victory himself. Mansell did not finish a race any lower than 2nd place, helping to secure his championship, whilst Patrese would only be classified off the podium twice the entire season. The FW14B has gone down in Formula 1 legend for its technological advancements and its dominance, and some of the cars are still in running condition today, especially the one that is owned by Sebastian Vettel and converted to run on sustainable fuels. The technological advancements that made the FW14B so dominant would be banned just 2 years later, and Williams would have to start from scratch. Fortunately, they had a certain Adrian Newey in their employment. For 1996, Williams entered the FW18, designed by Adrian Newey and driven by Damon Hill and rookie Jacques Villeneuve. The FW18 would mark a return to dominance for Williams, after 2 years as runner-up in 1994 and 1995. Decked out in the beautiful Rothmans livery and powered by a 3-litre Renault V10, the FW18 would seldom finish off the podium. The reliability of the car was also rock solid, only suffering 2 mechanical retirements across the season. The FW18 would win 12 races across the 16-round season, with 8 coming at the hands of Damon Hill, who would go on to become world champion at the final race in Japan, after Villeneuve, his teammate and only championship rival, spun off. One has to wonder, however, just how much of the car's dominance was due to it being a good car, and the rest due to the team's stability, as Williams was the only of the 3 major teams of the previous 2 seasons to not have any major personnel changes, with much of Benetton's personnel following Michael Schumacher to Ferrari, who then had to acclimate to their new environment. That's not to say the FW18 wasn't a solid piece of engineering, it certainly was, but Benetton and Ferrari certainly didn't have very stable teams at the time, something that would start to affect Williams that very same year. Chief designer Adrian Newey had already come to blows with the team and would be departing for McLaren in 1997. He would be placed on gardening leave for the remainder of the 1996 season. Another important team member to be ousted would be world champion Damon Hill, who was to be replaced by German driver Heinz-Harald Frentzen for 1997, despite the fact that he was winning the championship. 1996 would be the last taste of dominance that Williams would ever taste, as the team's decline had already begun. 1997 would be a season that they would only win narrowly in both championships. 1997 would also be the last year that Williams would win a championship at all, taking drivers' and constructors' titles, and nothing since. and 1997 would also be the last season that Williams would be the Works Renault outfit, with Renault withdrawing from Formula 1 even only temporarily at the end of the season. Competing in the 1999 Formula 1 season and driven by Ralf Schumacher and Alessandro Zanardi, the Williams FW21 was the second of just two Williams to have red as the primary colour, something that Frank Williams himself vowed to never use again after this season concluded. Using a 1997 spec Renault V10 engine badged as a Super Tech, the FW21 proved to be woefully uncompetitive compared to its predecessors. Ralf Schumacher would score all 35 points that the team would score that season, with Zanardi not adapting to Formula 1, being more used to Indy cars instead. Although they scored only 3 points less than they did in the previous season, Jordan and Stewart both upped their game, and Williams as a result fell to 5th in the Constructors. But for 2000, Williams would take on a brand new Works engine deal with returning German manufacturer BMW. Competing in the 2003 Formula 1 season and driven by Ralf Schumacher and Juan Pablo Montoya, the Williams FW25 was the fourth Williams to be powered by BMW V10 engines. The P83 power plant is regarded as one of the most powerful Formula 1 engines of the time, and it certainly showed, as the car was an absolute rocket ship in a straight line. 2003 would prove to be the most competitive season of the Ferrari dominance years, and Williams was right up there with Ferrari and McLaren fighting for championship glory. The first half of Williams' season was not that great, however, as the team would only finish on the podium once before tyre upgrades at the Monaco Grand Prix saw the FW25 propelled to race-winning potential, and the car would take two 1-2 finishes in a row at the European and French Grand Prix, with victory going to Schumacher. Montoya would take two Grand Prix victories himself, the first at Monaco and the second at Germany, where he also took pole and fastest lap. However, this upturn in form for Williams would not last, as the wider Michelin spec front tyres that the team had received at the Monaco Grand Prix would later be outlawed, and the team would be forced to return to the narrower tyres that the car had not been so competitive on. When the redesigned front tyres were introduced at the Italian Grand Prix, the car's pace predictably dropped off, and the car would fail to win a race for the remainder of the season. Montoya had been in championship contention before that, but he dropped to 11 points behind Schumacher by the time the season ended, finishing third in the Drivers' Championship, even behind Kimi Räikkönen. Williams, however, would do better in the Constructors' Championship, finishing second with 144 points. Only 14 points behind Constructors' Champions Ferrari, and a narrow 2 points ahead of third-placed McLaren. The FW25 would prove to be the most successful BMW Williams, with the following year's FW26 being uncompetitive and the relationship between Williams and BMW breaking down by the end of 2005. As of the final race of the 2024 season, the FW25 is the last Williams to score a 1-2 finish. For the 2010 Formula 1 season, Williams entered the FW32, driven by veteran Rubens Barrichello and reigning GP2 champion Nico Hülkenberg. FW32 would be a return to Cosworth power for Williams, after a single-year stint in 2006, and before that, having last run Ford Cosworth power in 1982. The car, however, was more of the same from Williams, as the team was well into its decline by this point, and had not won a race since the final round of 2004. The team was solidly in the midfield at this point, and although it would score fairly frequently, it wouldn't score any podiums, unlike two of its three Toyota-powered predecessors. The car was thoroughly unremarkable, only scoring 69 points, which was enough for 6th in the Constructors' Championship. But it did do one remarkable thing. Nico Hülkenberg would score pole position at the Brazilian Grand Prix, the only highlight of the car's career. 2011 saw Williams field the Cosworth-powered FW33, driven by Rubens Barrichello and Venezuelan Pastor Maldonado. The FW33 was woefully uncompetitive compared to its direct predecessor, and the 2011 season would go on to be comfortably the worst in the team's history, being even worse than the team's debut season in 1978, as the team would only score 5 points across the entire season, 6 less than in 1978. Sure, the car may have had a somewhat attractive looking pseudo-Rothmans livery, but looking good is no substitute for going fast. Those 5 points were only enough for 9th place in the Constructors' Championship, ahead of only the 3 2010 Minnows. This would be the last Formula 1 car that Rubens Barrichello would ever drive, and I bet he wished he was still driving for Brawn. (2012) would see Williams return to Renault power for the FW34, and they would retain Pastor Maldonado and take on Bruno Senna to replace the outgoing Barrichello. The FW34 would prove to be a reasonable improvement over its predecessor, as it would actually manage to score decent points in the first 3 rounds, with Senna scoring a 6th place into 7th place and Maldonado an 8th. However, with the 2012 season being the 2012 season, the Williams found itself being remarkably quick at the 5th round in Spain, with Maldonado qualifying on the front row and inheriting pole position from Lewis Hamilton after he was disqualified. Although Maldonado would lose the lead at turn 1, he would retake the lead through a strategy masterclass, denying Alonso his 2nd home victory and converting his inherited pole position to victory, taking his first and only Grand Prix victory and Williams' first since 2004, and unfortunately their most recent Grand Prix victory to date. After winning that race, Maldonado would then fail to score for the next 9 Grand Prix in a row, before finally finishing 8th in Japan, and then 2 more points finishes in the final 3 races. Bruno Senna meanwhile would score much more frequently, but would never finish higher than 6th, and he would ultimately be dropped from the team at the end of the season. The team would score 76 points that season, which would only be enough for 8th in the Constructors' Championship. They could possibly have finished higher if Maldonado had not been completely useless for 9 races after his victory, with one of those races including essentially instigating the starting line crash at the Belgian Grand Prix. The pace of the car was simply confusing, as sometimes it was a midfielder, sometimes it was a clear backmarker, and of course, for a single race only, it had race-winning potential. Race-winning potential that seemingly went up in smoke, if conspiracy theories are to be believed, as not long after Maldonado crossed the finishing line in Spain, the Williams garage caught fire, with many believing that this was intentional destruction of evidence that Williams had cheated, or had been giving cheating stuff for Frank Williams' birthday. Come on guys, it's ridiculous. What next? Ayrton Senna was shot by a sniper? 2013 did not get off to a good start for Williams, as they had to redesign the FW35 before the season had even begun, owing to an illegal exhaust. Despite this, the car performed reasonably well in pre-season testing, and both Maldonado and new driver Valtteri Bottas liked how the car was progressing. And then the car received upgrades at the first race in Australia, which even Maldonado called undrivable. Yes, that Maldonado, Crash Tour Maldonado, called this car undrivable. And it really showed. The car could not score points on all but 2 occasions, with Maldonado scoring a single 10th place and Bottas scoring a single 8th place at the United States Grand Prix. The team could only score 5 points across the season, the exact number of points they scored in 2011, which again was only enough for 9th place. And not for a lack of trying, as Bottas qualified 3rd in Canada, only to drop to 14th by the checkered flag, making this the joint worst season in Williams' history up to this point. For 2014, Williams introduced the FW36, driven by Felipe Massa and Valtteri Bottas, and powered by a new Mercedes-Benz hybrid power unit. The team also adopted a low drag philosophy, which, when coupled with the dominant Mercedes power unit, created a car that was exceptionally quick in a straight line and was consistently the quickest car in pre-season testing. In competition, however, the car was generally only the second or third fastest. But considering where they'd been for the past few seasons, this was a marked improvement. The team went from barely getting out of Q1 and being almost incapable of scoring points to becoming regular point scorers, and after upgrades, even standing on the podium. The car would be predominantly white as the team took on a brand new title sponsor in the form of Martini, and coupled with the blue and red stripes of the sponsor, the livery is one that is well regarded even 10 years on. The FW36 was not initially the most competitive machine. Although it was scoring points regularly, the car's true potential wasn't unlocked until upgrades at the Canadian Grand Prix, which saw Massa fighting for a podium until he was crashed out. Then at the next round in Austria, Massa would achieve a pole position for Williams, the team's first since the Spanish Grand Prix of 2012, and his first since 2008. In fact, the two Williams would lock out the front row, the only front row lockout by a team other than Mercedes that season. But unfortunately, the team could not convert it to a victory, as the Mercedes was just too dominant. The highlight of the team's season would perhaps come at the final round of the season, where they would finish 2-3. And owing to the double points format of that Grand Prix, they would score the most points ever by a single team in a single weekend. At least until the sprint race format came along. Despite the inherent pace of the FW36, the team ultimately could not win a single Grand Prix that season, with Red Bull picking up the pieces whenever Mercedes fell apart. But it was still a good season for Williams, and they would finish third in the Constructors' Championship with 320 points, their best season in more than 10 years. For 2015, Williams introduced the redesigned FW37, doing away with the strange Anteater-style nose of its predecessor for a more conventional looking nose. The team retained everything that had made their previous season as competitive as it had been, with Felipe Massa, Valtteri Bottas, Mercedes engines, and a low drag concept. They even had some things going in their favour, with 2014 runners-up Red Bull falling down the order, which should have allowed Williams to pick up the pieces, only for Ferrari to take their place instead. Unlike with Red Bull, who had simply been more consistent in 2014, Ferrari was clearly the second fastest car over Williams, and the FW37 could only manage 4 third-place podium finishes, compared to the 9 podiums of its predecessor. The team would finish third in the Constructors' Championship again, but this time they had less points to their name, only 257, a sign that things were not going to be rosy for much longer. 2016 started off fairly well for Williams, who entered the FW38. The car retained the powerful Mercedes engines and the low drag concept, which allowed it to pick up the fastest speed ever recorded in a Formula 1 session. An incredible 235 miles per hour, or 378 kilometers an hour. Unfortunately for Williams, going fast in a straight line is not all that Formula 1 is about, and the car struggled in other ways. Although the car was reasonably competitive in the opening half of the season, it would not receive many upgrades, which allowed Force India to overtake them for 4th in the Constructors' Championship, which Williams had only fallen into after Red Bull got their act together and re-established the top 3 teams. As a result of the lacking upgrades, the FW38's pace fell off as the season went on, and it could only achieve a single 3rd place podium finish at the hands of Bottas. This would be Bottas's last Williams F1 car, as he would move to Mercedes for the following season. For 2017, Williams skipped a number and named their new car the FW40 in honour of their 40th anniversary in the sport. Valtteri Bottas would be replaced by Canadian rookie Lance Stroll, and Felipe Massa would be retained, even though he had initially been planning to retire at the end of the previous season. The FW40 was unfortunately the start of Williams' second decline in the sport, as the car could not consistently finish in the points. Lance Stroll proved that he wasn't particularly good, as he was crashing a fair amount, and he only managed to score his first points at his home race in Canada, 7 rounds into the season. Then at the following race in Azerbaijan, he managed to pick up a podium, through sheer luck really. This 3rd place that Stroll scored would go on to be the last podium that Williams would score under normal racing conditions. The team would finish 5th in the Constructors' Championship yet again, but this time with even less points, only 83. For 2018, Lance Stroll would be partnered by Russian driver Sergei Sirotkin to drive the FW41 after Felipe Massa finally retired. Unfortunately for Williams, the rot had well and truly set in, and the FW41 would be the worst Williams since the FW35 of 2013. The car would only score points 3 times across the entire season, an 8th in Azerbaijan and a double points finish in Italy, with Stroll leading Sirotkin home in 9th and 10th respectively. This meant that the team only scored 7 points, making this season their 3rd worst in their history, at least as far as points are concerned. Those 7 points were only enough for 10th in the Constructors' Championship, meaning the team finished dead last for the first time in their history, their worst finishing position in the Constructors since they entered a customer march in 1977.
30.6.
"2019 started incredibly badly for Williams, perhaps the worst start to a Formula 1 season in Formula 1 history. Well, maybe. The car would not be completed in time for a shakedown or even the first 2 days of pre-season testing, and when they finally did arrive, the new FW42 was miles off the pace. The fastest lap that the car could achieve was a second and a half slower than the leading Ferrari of Sebastian Vettel, and more than half a second slower than the next slowest car on the grid. And not only that, it was illegal as well. The team would employ 2 new drivers, rookie George Russell, fresh off GP2 Championship glory, and Robert Kubica, finally returning to the sport after his horrific rallying crash in 2011. The years had not been kind to Robert, however. His time spent away from Formula 1 and his injury meant that he was by far the slowest driver on the grid, and he never managed to out-qualify George Russell. George meanwhile tried his best, but couldn't manage to drag the car out of Q1 for the entire season, only managing a best qualifying position of 16th at the Hungarian Grand Prix. The two Williams almost always locked out the final row of the grid, and the pace of the car was so poor that it saw Chief Technical Officer Paddy Lowe fired from the team. The team looked set to have their first pointless season since the team's first with a March chassis in 1977. But fortune would shine a sliver of light on them at the German Grand Prix when Robert Kubica inherited 10th place, after the 2 Alfa Romeos would be disqualified. This single 10th place would give Williams a solitary point, preventing them from finishing the season completely pointless, but still being by far the worst season in the team's history. The FW42 has gone down in history as by far the worst Williams racing car ever made. A car that is a complete laughingstock, being one of the latest additions to the F1 Hall of Shame, alongside shitboxes like the Life L190. 2019 was certainly a year for Williams to forget. The FW43 turned up to 2020 pre-season testing looking rather different to how we all know it today. The car, still sponsored by Rocket, looked a bit like a toothpaste tube, but it didn't wear this livery for very long as the sponsorship deal would collapse before the season began. The FW43 performed far better than its predecessor in the first race of the season, with Nicholas Latifi finishing 11th. However, this was perhaps more due to the high attrition rate of that particular Grand Prix than the car's inherent pace, as it would fail to get out of Q1 for the next couple of races and usually finish the races way down the order. It turned out that the FW43 was rather sensitive whilst running behind other cars, something which it was going to be doing a lot of because it was a backmarker car. As such, when both cars got out of Q1 in the Hungarian Grand Prix, they ultimately only finished 18th and 19th, the last cars running on track. Despite the various issues with the FW43, it had the potential to score points, at least in the hands of George Russell, who found himself infrequently in points-paying positions during various Grand Prix, such as running in 9th for an extended period of time in the Tuscan Grand Prix, and finding himself in 10th at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix. Unfortunately for George and Williams, none of these opportunities would come to pass. George would retire with low fuel pressure at the season-opening Austrian Grand Prix and would have a completely unforced crash behind the safety car at Imola. Ultimately, the best that the FW43 could do was a handful of 11th place finishes, making this the first Williams-built Formula 1 car to not score a single point in their history. It was a rather sour note for Claire Williams and Sir Frank Williams to go out on, as this would also be the last Williams F1 car built under their tutelage. They would sell the team and depart at the Italian Grand Prix, and American investment firm Dalton Capital would take over the reins. But they wouldn't rename the team, they would acknowledge its heritage and allow it to remain as Williams. As with every other team for the 2021 season, Williams was forced to adapt the FW43 for the 2021 rules, and thus they created the FW43B. Unlike the last Williams car to have a B spec, the FW14B of 1992, the FW43B was nowhere near as competitive or as dominant, but it did fix a lot of the issues of its predecessor. It was a bit more consistent and capable of getting into Q2 a lot more frequently, but it still wasn't quick enough for regular points finishes. In fact, it took until the 9th round in Austria for the team to replicate their best result of the previous season, 11th place. But they wouldn't have to wait much longer after that to one-up that by quite a bit. At the Hungarian Grand Prix, the two Williams cars found themselves in an incredible position, with both cars running in the points for an extended period of the race, with Latifi ahead of Russell. At the checkered flag, they would finish 8th and 9th, which would become 7th and 8th after Sebastian Vettel was disqualified. An incredible double points finish that lifted them off the bottom of the Constructors' Championship table and well into 8th place, ahead of even Alfa Romeo. The good fortunes wouldn't stop there, however, for at the very next round in Belgium, George Russell would put in an absolutely scintillating wet qualifying lap, which put him onto the front row alongside pole sitter Max Verstappen, with George's lap just 0.3 slower than Max's. This front row start would eventually be converted into a rather lame second place podium finish after just a single classified lap of racing, air quotes. Latifi meanwhile would finish 9th, with the half points that the team was awarded earning them another 10 points in addition to those they scored in the previous round. George would score 2 more times in the remaining rounds, giving Williams a total of 23 points, which was more than enough to secure 8th in the Constructors' Championship. Amidst the joy of finishing 8th, there was also the sadness that came with the passing of the team's founder and its namesake. Sir Frank Williams would pass away only days before the penultimate round in Saudi Arabia. It was truly an end of an era. Williams' first ground effect car in 40 years, the FW44, was hoped to be able to carry on the success of the previous season, something which it ultimately didn't do. With George Russell Mercedes bound, he was replaced by Thai driver Alexander Albon, who to his credit performed rather well, having last driven a Formula 1 car in 2020 for Red Bull. The FW44 was unfortunately a massive step back for Williams, who found themselves back in 10th place after avoiding it the previous year. Although they would still score points, managing to score 8 across the season, it was nowhere near enough to lift them off the bottom of the table. Albon would score 5 over those points over 3 occasions. Latifi would only score a single 9th place at the Japanese Grand Prix, and the remaining 2 points would come from a 9th place scored by Nick de Vries in a Super Sub appearance, which would earn him a drive with AlphaTauri the following season. For Williams though, they had to do better. Nicholas Latifi would be dropped by Williams for 2023 after 3 seasons of lackluster performances. He would be replaced by American driver Logan Sargent, who honestly wasn't much better, though no one knew that at the time. They thought he was going to be great, but that's by the by. Together, he and Alexander Albon would drive the FW45 in the 2023 season, and it was a car that proved to be much better than its immediate predecessor. At least in the hands of Albon, who scored all but one of the car's 28 points, managing a best finish of 2 7th places. Logan meanwhile could only manage a single 10th place at one of his 3 home races in the United States, namely the one in Texas. But this wasn't due to any of his own merits, rather through the disqualification of 2 drivers higher up the field. The FW45 was clearly a better car than the 3 teams behind it, with the Haas being by far the slowest, the Alfa Romeo being next slowest, and then the AlphaTauri usually being the slowest until an uptick in performance in the final few races, which saw them challenging for 7th towards the end of the season, something which they ultimately failed by just 3 points. 7th place was the improvement that Williams were looking for, but there was still no doubt that the car was a backmarker, as the team would finish almost 100 points behind 6th placed Alpine. Alongside Logan Sargent, one of the other new figures to join the team in 2023 was former Mercedes chief strategist James Vowles, who would join the team as team principal to replace the outgoing Jost Capito. James Vowles would see that the team had multiple issues, such as having every single car part listed on an Excel spreadsheet, something which clearly isn't ideal. Under his oversight and leadership, the team can start to actually make some progress, and 2023 was seen as the start of that progress. Many of the old technological holdovers would have to be done away with, including Williams' signature butterfly steering wheel, something that every other team had dropped by 2016. The FW45 would therefore be the last Williams car to use this type of steering wheel, and would also hopefully be the last Williams to be total crap. The FW46 would be the car that Williams Grand Prix Engineering would introduce for the 2024 season, and like its predecessors, it was total crap. Mostly. The car would fail to score until the 8th round in Monaco, when Alexander Albon finally managed to pick up a 9th place. As part of updates to their manufacturing process to try and modernise the team produced a lot of metal car parts, which made the car almost half a second slower than its rivals, as the car was exceeding the minimum weight limit. These issues would gradually be ironed out, and the car would start to more regularly score points towards the end of the season, but it wasn't a frequent point scorer by any stretch of the imagination. Alex Albon could only manage to get 4 points finishes out of the car, 3 9th places and a 7th, whilst Logan Sargent couldn't score at all. In fact, he became increasingly crash prone as the season went on, and after heavily crashing his car at the first round back after the summer break in the Netherlands, his fate was sealed and he would be replaced by Argentine driver Franco Colapinto. In only his second race for Williams, Colapinto scored 4 times more points for Williams than Logan had in his entire career for the team. Sure, it was only 8th place, which is worth 4 points, but still, that's more than the single 10th place that Logan managed. Colapinto would score 1 more time after this, a 10th place at the United States Grand Prix, and then he wouldn't score again after this, as his rookie status started to show, as he too became rather crash-prone as the season went on. That 10th place would ultimately prove to be Williams' last points of the season, but they were still in 8th place in the Constructors' Championship, just a few points ahead of Alpine, who then went on to get a double podium in Sao Paulo for reasons. With only 17 points to their name, Williams fell down to 9th in the Constructors' Championship, a disappointing result after a fairly good late mid-season. It's very clear that if Williams wants to return to their championship winning ways, they have a lot of work to do, and it's work that James Vowles is spearheading. For 2025, Alexander Albon will partner Carlos Sainz, and hopefully the FW47 will be the car to drag Williams out of their perennial backmarker status.